before I kind of get into the kind of body of what I want to say to you, I want to say kind of briefly as a kind of prologue that as a Canadian, I think the stereotype of Canadians is that they're always apologizing. And so just to keep in the spirit of that, I'll start with sort of three apologies. One, of course, I'm here from a very long way away, and that's, has things attached to it like jet lag and things like that. But more importantly, or more substantively, much of the work that I'll speak to is a long diatribe about how it's just wrong to batch process Indigenous people and imagine you can paint them all with the same tarred brush. That is, I'm very interested in variability within the communities that I study. And much of what I'll say in a moment is about that. And having convinced myself that it's very important to be attentive to how communities differ one from the other, of course, it's directly in my face that I'm now 18,000 miles from home, and so the prospect that what I have to say will somehow generalize is an iffy proposition. And so in the question and answer period that's meant to take up the second half of this hour, I think that will be a topic of concern. Am I too close to this thing? Probably. The second thing I want to say in my long litany of apologies is that suicide is a very heart-rending topic. In my own life, and perhaps the lives of many of you, there have been suicides and they broke your heart. And but I'm going to talk about it, this heartfelt problem, with a bunch of actuarial statistics, with a bunch of kind of heady theoretical commentary, and a bunch of bookish comments. So I need to somehow excuse myself for touching on such an emotionally charged topic in a way that is pretty straight-faced. And then finally, you'll learn about me in this short time that I'm a kind of heady person who thinks a lot about theory. And so I'll probably talk more about theory than you have any right to expect. So again, but I'll try to make the case for that. And the example that again I used yesterday was that very early on in my academic career, I was a graduate student, and so I was dragooned as a foot soldier in a project that was meant to contrast a bunch of hospitalized schizophrenic patients with their keepers, their ward attendants. That was the control group. And people had collected some 200 biomarkers about these two samples of hospitalized people in their hospital wards. And then they threw it all into a computer, and one thing popped out as dramatically differentiating the two groups. And it had something to do with citric acid derivatives. And just before my PIs, the PIs of that project went to press, someone reminded them that the state of California mandated that every hospitalized patient get a glass of orange juice each day, and the people who were their guards couldn't afford it. And so what was meant to be the cutting edge difference between schizophrenic and non-schizophrenic people was all a matter of dietary practice. And I sort of promised myself on the heels of that I wouldn't do research that wasn't theory-driven in some way. So I'll want to begin here in a moment saying a few words about that sort of theoretical backdrop that shapes my work. And I think in a broad sense my work falls into two sort of camps. Half of it is work that explores issues in identity development in individual youth, one individual youth at a time, with interviews and various kinds of psychological assessment procedures. The other half, and what I think is perhaps the more interesting half for the purposes of this audience, is to try to kick that issue of identity development upstairs, if you will, and to talk about cultural identity and the preservation of cultural identity in a changing world. So for the sake of abbreviating matters, I'll leave out of this talk everything that has to do with the individual assessment of individual youth, and more or less leap directly into talking about identity issues as they impact whole cultural groups, and in particular indigenous community groups. If there's, I suppose, a single thing that boils up out of all that work that I'll allude to, it's that it's something like cultural wounds require cultural medicine. And I'll unpack that as I go on to talk. The original talk had 5 easy pieces. I've edited this down from 5 to 4 to 3, as you just heard. And so I'll talk in the first instance about it's a catchphrase from the contemporary American philosopher Owen Flanagan, who talks about the oneself to a customer rule. And I'll try to say what I mean by that. And that'll be sort of my excuse to build a bit of a theoretical tent for the work that I talk about. And then I'll jump into talking about epidemiology, particularly the epidemiology of suicide in what are called First Nations communities in Western Canada. Canada has 3 kinds, broad types of indigenous people. There are Inuit people, who used to be Eskimos. There's Métis people, who are a little hard to define, but in the Boer instance were the offspring of French trappers and Aboriginal women. And then First Nations people, who are sort of the closest you can come to sort of the stereotype of an American Indian. So it's really that's the largest group in Western Canada. It's the group that I'll be speaking about. And I'll end by trying to extract a few action or policy implications that I think follow from the work that I've done. And then hopefully that will be a spur to questions that you'll have, or discussions that you'd like to engage in here in this room. So that's the plan. And so let me say briefly, how are we doing in terms of, I stopped barking into the microphone. Can you hear me okay in the back? I'm traditionally a soft-spoken person, so if I fade, wave at me or something and let me know that I'm not communicating. And the issue that I want to talk about certainly is a larger issue than the work about indigenous identity. And it really has to do with the whole possible meaning of the notion of identity, or personhood, or selfhood, or being an individual on the one hand, or being a recognizable cultural group on the other. So the problem is, it turns on the kind of paradox of sameness and change, or the antinomy of sameness and change. We all live in a world that's in constant flux. Life's a whirligig. You can't put your foot in the same river twice. And so those are all philosophic saws about this endemic problem that while we must, of course, always change, and when I say we, I mean we as individuals and probably we as members of whole cultural groups. At the same time, our conceptions of personhood and our conceptions of what constitutes a culture presuppose some enduring persistence of something, the capacity to somehow recognize and re-recognize a person or a group as an instance of itself. So, you know, a many thousands of year old problem then that's faced, I think, any thoughtful person is how do you understand yourself as somehow an individual that persists in time and whose existence is constituted by the mere fact that you do persist. I mean, imagine that you just winked in and out of existence. St. Peter couldn't keep track of who's to be allowed in and out of the golden gates, pearly gates. We'd all be amnesics, forgetting who we were and where we came from. We wouldn't have a stake in our own as yet unrealized futures. I mean, here's me, you know, I spent half my adult life sitting on my hands outside of professors' doors waiting to get graded on something, right? And I put up with all that indignity simply because I care about the person I'm en route to becoming. Okay? And to connect this, as I will mean to in a moment more clearly, connect this to suicide, I'm, as you can probably sense, kind of a depressive character. And thoughts of suicide occupy me on a daily basis. But the idea of wonderful me splatted out on the floor or my car up against a tree or something, that's an acceptable view for me. I care about the person I'm en route to become. And if I didn't, I would have shuffled off this coil a long time ago. And that's worth, I think, remembering and generalizing, because there are whole communities in which people don't have a stake in their own future. And when that happens, death is never very far away. There are various ways of talking about this. William James, an American philosopher who said everything better than everyone else, said that life is like a skiff with a bow as well as a stern. And in that metaphor, he meant to draw attention to the fact that we're both backward referring, that we hold on to, keep a tether to our traditional past or our personal past, or as cultural groups, our traditional cultural past. And seen off the bow, we're concerned about where this skiff is going, and we have commitment to that and have some steerage over where it's going. And when that fails, when we have no forward anticipating way of assuring our identity as individuals or cultural groups, hell is to pay. So that's probably all I need to say about the concept of continuity, which I'm now going to spend the rest of my 20 minutes or so talking about. And I guess the only thing to say about this is that I've already talked about the paradox of sameness and change. Continuity isn't, in the way I would use the term, sameness. It's a way of arbitrating the inevitability of change and the need for sameness. I mean, sameness, perhaps I didn't say quite enough about that. Imagine that if you couldn't be identified and re-identified, practically nothing would work. Contracts would be meaningless. Marriages would be meaningless. Human relationships would be meaningless. We have to somehow identify and re-identify ourselves. And as a developmental psychologist, I spent a lot of years looking at how young people think about that problem as they change, as they grow up. I've also spent some time doing cross-cultural work, worrying about how people in one culture as opposed to another think about the sameness of themselves, of their cultures. But all of that stuff is on the cutting room floor today. And I mean now to go on to talk about continuity, that is the way in which not individuals but whole cultural groups somehow manage to persist in time by having a tether to and owning their past, to be backward referring, and also forward anticipating in terms of having some sense of ownership and control of their own future. Okay. Now, the talk of suicide here, I mean, I don't really, frankly, care very much about suicide. I mean, I care about it as an outcome measure. It's the tip of, like, the worst iceberg. Okay? But it's not just a unique thing. Some of the research, it's not research I'll talk about, is about accident rates. Aboriginal people in Canada drive their truck off the road, cut their leg off with a chainsaw, do all, you know, they just don't show care and concern. They don't buckle up. Okay? I buckle up. I practice safe sex. I care about what's going to happen to me. I don't want to be splattered all over a tree. Okay? But, so, accidents are just a step back from suicide. But lots of other things are a step back. HIV infection and putting yourself in harm's way. Obesity, diabetes, all kinds of things that could go wrong and do so regularly go wrong in Indigenous communities have as their kind of common link the fact that those are things that happen to people without a sense of ownership of past and future. That's the hypothesis under study, if you will. Okay? So let me tell you, recognizing then that suicide is just the kind of titular issue to focus attention on rather than the whole bloody picture. Let me tell you a little bit about suicide as it occurs in Canada. This graph simply shows that Indigenous people have higher rates of suicide than non-Indigenous people, and that it's especially true of young Indigenous people. That's that big bar over there, dark blue bar on your right. These are a couple of pie charts. This just shows that the percentage of the population in the province that I live in, British Columbia, is only 3% First Nations, but 9% of the suicides are by First Nations people. This shows that among the youth, that among all the young people who kill themselves, 1 in 4 is an Indigenous person. And among all of those Indigenous people who commit suicide, more than half are young people. So it's a big problem, and it's a big problem among young people. Now, having said that, I want to emphasize that all that's just lies, damn lies and statistics. And the reason I say that is because all of those things are actuarial fictions. And what I mean by actuarial fiction is that, okay, there are 203 distinct First Nations bands in British Columbia. There are more than 600 across the whole of Canada. These groups have... Yeah, a band is what you would call a tribe or a mob, maybe. I don't know if I've got my vocabulary down yet. But these are people who, if you say, "What are you?" they will say, "I'm a Musqueam person," which is the name of one of the bands. Okay. So these bands are scattered over a geographic area the size of Western Washington, Western Australia, and the size of Western Europe. It's a big place. It's, in the case of British Columbia, it's very mountainous. It's the extension of the Rocky Mountains. And so you can live in one place and 20 miles away is somebody, your neighbor, who no one has ever met because there's a big mountain in the way. And so in British Columbia, there are 14 mutually uninterpretable languages. They've had different roads to hoe with colonizers in terms of how remote and inaccessible they are. They have different spiritual beliefs. They're just as different as you can imagine anybody being different. And the government is often charged with what's the suicide rate of Aboriginal people in British Columbia. What you do is just add up all the Indigenous people and divide by N, and you get an actuarial fiction. It's a number that contains no human meaning, okay? Because you're just adding apples and oranges, if you will. It's a real fruit salad. This just repeats something I said. There's Canada, there's British Columbia over there on your left. That's its footprint. There's the footprint of Western Europe. I should have had one of WA, but you'd see it's all about the same size. So it's a big. These are big places with lots of different kinds of people. And then let's talk about that actuarial fiction, what I just tried to explain to you. Recognizing that it's an offense to simply batch process, paint with the same broad brush all of these indigenous people. The question is, well, how could you chop it up and disaggregate it in some more meaningful way? It turns out that, like anyplace else, British Columbia has different census districts. Somebody with a pen drew the map to get the right number of voters in each quadrant. And so there are 30 census districts, and you can see with the line in blue that the suicide rate doesn't really change for non-indigenous people, depending on their census district. But the picture in red for the Aboriginal community is radically sawtooth, and it's extremely high in some places and touches the ground in others. Okay? And while that's interesting, it's nonsensical because census districts make no conceptual sense. Here's another thing that doesn't make any conceptual sense. These are health regions. Again, the province is just chopped up into administrative health regions. And again, the same picture is present there, that it doesn't matter what health region you're in. If you're not indigenous, your risk of suicide is about the same. But again, it's radically divergent, one community to the next, in terms of First Nations people.
Does that take into account, like where it's zero, is that zero suicides because there are no indigenous people in that district?
Well, that's why it's meaningless, because we can't answer that question. I mean, you could theoretically answer the question, but in general, you don't know. So it could be zero, just as you suggest, because there aren't any Aboriginal people in the first place, or because there are lots of Aboriginal people, but none of them committed suicide. So to sort out that, this is a better way. This is the 203 bands in British Columbia, and the suicide rate for each of those bands over a period of 5 years. And that was devilishly hard to get, by the way. But again, the same pattern of sawtooth radical differences is evident, and it's also evident that that line touches the ground in many places. Here's a different way of arraying that same information. More than half of the 203 bands in British Columbia have never had a youth suicide. We've only got maybe 25 years of records here, but in that 25-year period, there's just zero suicides. Lower, I point out, than the general population. And I'll come back to that point because it's important. And then you see it goes up and up and up and up, and then there are groups in which more than 1,000 times the national rate. Now, if there are statisticians among you, you'll be alert to the possibility that these bands are sometimes quite small, 500 people. And one suicide in a band of 500 people, since suicides are ordinarily counted per 100,000, can spike the thing way up. And that's just an inescapable problem, but you can moderate the seriousness of the problem by aggregating these 203 bands if there is a culturally coherent way of doing it. And it turns out that there is, because there's something called tribal councils. A few times these are artifices of government, but for the most part they're similar communities living in similar places with a common language. There are something like 27 such tribal councils, each with more than a dozen bands in them. So at least you bump the end way up from a statistical point of view. And this is just shows you, again, the suicide, the variability in suicide rates by tribal council. Okay? So it's a spit in the direction of trying to deal with a small n problem. That just shows the same thing again, indicating that aggregated in this way, still kind of one in 4 or 5 of these tribal councils also has never had a suicide. Now, so having made that point with you, that you can't talk about indigenous suicide rates for the province or through the country. That's an actuarial fiction. What you have to do is disaggregate those arbitrarily joined numbers and try to disaggregate it in a way that makes conceptual sense, and tribes or bands are understood to be, and I think are correctly understood to be, culturally cohesive groups. Okay. We now have kind of hard evidence, if you will, that there's enormous variability across these groups, and what inquiring minds want to know. Okay. As soon as I show you that, you've got to say, well, what's different about those bands that have these heartbreakingly high suicide rates, and what distinguishes them from those who have no suicides, lower suicide rates than the general population. So that's the problem to be attacked. Okay. I've already.
Go for it. Keep going.
I'll finish in 5 minutes if that's okay. So, I mean, we're trying to answer the problem that's in your mind, right? What's different about those groups? And now there's a kind of a dumb way to do it. And it's a little bit like that first study I told you about, where you just pile up a bunch of numbers and troll through them in the hopes that you'll snag something. And if you do, you don't know what it means, like orange juice. That's probably not a very good way to proceed. You could have some kind of other sort of working hypothesis. You might think, well, it's all down to how remote they are or how urbanized they are. So we made a stab at that. Turns out it correlates 0 with suicide rates. That might not be true in some parts of Australia from what I've been told, but it's true in British Columbia. The closest thing to a relationship between suicide rates and demography is that if you happen to be living on the outskirts of an urban area, your band's traditional land is with somewhere that you can see the lights sparkling on the horizon, but you can't quite get there. That group has a slightly higher suicide rate than the really remote or the really urbanized. But it's just significant by a hair. You could try to get SES measures, socioeconomic measures. Turns out that's devilishly hard to do with indigenous communities. Their money comes in strange ways from government sources for the most part. And so things like income adequacy, unemployment, labor force skills are rough proxies of SES. None of those correlate with suicide rates, nor does population density. So the things that might first leap to mind seem not to work. So where's the theory? The theory should tell us, at least the theory I've been working on, it's a little grand to call it theory, but it's a working set of assumptions. It tells us, should prepare us to find out that communities that have a tether to their past and a sense of control over their own civic future are going to be the communities with low suicide rates. Now imagine that you've got to try to figure out a way of measuring that, and you've got to measure it in such a way that you have a measure for all 203 bands. So you're not free to just pick and choose anything you want. You've got to be able to capitalize on existing evidence of some sort or collect it yourself. And here is, well, that's what I just showed you about the rural, urban, remote, that there's a kind of a bit of a peak. for people who are rural, that is not really remote, but near to big cities. So here's a list of 9 factors, which are either meant to be somehow about connections to one's cultural past or to one's civic future, control over one's civic future. Sometimes it's hard to say which category these things go into. So like one of them is to achieve some measure of self-government. Well, they used to all have self-government, but it's also future focus, because having self-government allows you to make decisions into the present and future. In British Columbia, there's a big issue about litigating for Aboriginal title to traditional lands. So we measured which communities were engaged in such litigations and trying to get Aboriginal title. Questions of whether the community exercises control over their own educational functions, the kids in school, whether they have some control over the delivery of health services, whether they have control over the policing and fire functions or judiciary functions, whether they've built a facility for the preservation of culture, like a longhouse or a tribal community building. Women in government's kind of an interesting one, because when colonizers arrived in British Columbia, women in First Nations communities had very powerful political positions, but the colonizers only wanted to talk to the men. So women were instantly demoted from their roles, and to the extent that this has been recouped, that's a measure of community control. Child protection services, we have, like, I think your word for it is the stolen generation. We have something called the 60 scoop and other weird words for talking about stealing the children of Aboriginal people. And then finally, the knowledge of Indigenous languages, which is kind of a complicated one, but I can talk more about that if you wish.
Why does this start?
That's exactly what I was going to tell you. You're so good at anticipating. The reason that the last 3 have starred is that this research has been going on for almost 17 years now. And we get at sort of 5-year intervals chunks of new data about the suicide rates or injury rates. We can access it. And so in a sense, we keep replicating our own work, trying to replicate it as each new wave of data comes in. So the first 6 were available to us at the time of our first iteration of this research. The last 3 were added and are present on data for the second and third wave. Does that make sense? What I just said? Okay. So you'll see some graphs that have 6 variables and others that have 9 or 8. Okay. This is the first 6 of these. It's just shows the correlation of each of these variables taken one at a time with suicide rates. And the point is simply that, yes, each one of them taken separately is predictive of suicide rate. More interesting, and this is probably the take-home slide, this and the next one, well, not quite. This is just the 9 now. But this is the kind of take-home slide. And so imagine you're in the first wave, you've got 6 of these cultural continuity factors. Every community that has all 6 of these factors has no suicides. And it's a direct linear function of how many of these factors you have, what the suicide rate is. This is cumulative, adding these 3 starred items. And now with this longer list, any community with all 8 of these factors has no suicides. Okay. Now I'll end by making 2 points, which I hope have action and policy implications. One of them I've already made to death, and it's this business about actuarial fictions, and the claim is there are no sort of monolithic indigens. There's no footprint, blueprint, stereotype of indigenous people that work, because they're as variable as I've demonstrated them to be. Now, the reason that it has policy implications is because it's the common practice of government. If they want to spend some money on something, they want to spread it evenly. So recently, $64 million was cut loose in the province of British Columbia to deal with suicide prevention of Aboriginal people. And those 100 bands that have never had a suicide got the same amount of money as those that have suicide rates 1,200 times the national average. So we're short-sheeting communities in desperate situations and in a spendthrift way overspending in communities that don't have problem X. So you can imagine how much trouble you would get into all of a sudden if you said, well, no, we're not going to do it that way. We're not going to give everyone the same amount. I mean, so there are political minefields out there, of course, but there's a way of proceeding rationally, however politically difficult it might be. The second point is a little more complicated, but I think equally self-evident if you think about it. And it has to do with, Christ, I keep going on, don't I? But let me just say this last word. I pretend that I'm writing a book on how to be a good colonizer. Okay? And chapter 1 in this imaginary book is how to defeat the very possibility of indigenous knowledge. Okay? I mean, if you're a colonizer and you go into some place and you credit the people there with knowing something, then you're not sort of morally entitled to tell them what to do. But if you can devaluate and essentially eliminate the conceptual possibility that indigenous people might actually know something, then you're entitled to treat them like children, to manage their affairs in their behalf, to take a paternalistic approach, to punish them for their spiritual beliefs, criminalize their cultural practices, etc. So that's just the way, I think, in colonizing enterprises work, and most efficiently, at least. Okay? And they've worked this way historically in Canada, and I suspect in Australia as well. But if you've got exactly half of the communities of British Columbia who have no suicides, lower suicide rates than the general population, you have to credit them with some knowledge about how to raise a kid in such a way that the kid believes that life is worth living. And the proof of that pudding is that kids don't kill themselves. Okay? So, I think the existence of variability, not just in suicide, but the same variability exists in all kinds of other markers, like school dropout rates, for example. There are communities in British Columbia that never graduated a kid from high school. There are other communities in which the graduation rate equals the general population, or exceeds it. So, historically, the way that the Canadian government has proceeded, and I guess the Australian government has proceeded, is whenever you got a problem, you invent this, you get a bunch of eggheads together, or bureaucrats together, in Ottawa, or New York City, or Canberra. They think up some fix to the problem. This now is parachuted into unwelcoming communities who are angered by the fact that the mere fact that they're being told exactly what to do by somebody else underscores their position of inferiority. And so they don't like it. It doesn't work because it's probably a stupid idea to begin with in many cases. Even if it was a good idea, it's often sabotaged. And it's just no way to run a railroad. What's the alternative? The alternative, I believe, is what I would like to call a lateral transfer of knowledge. If you have hard evidence that some communities have knowledge that solves social problems, then what you do is you work to transfer that knowledge that exists within indigenous communities to other communities that are doing more poorly. Now, that's not going to be necessarily easy either, but it at least defeats some of the usual objections, like made in Canberra or something. And governments tend to be interested in such ideas if for no other reason than it looks like it might be cheaper. Okay. So, all of that's meant to reinforce the first thing I said, which is that cultural wounds require cultural medicine. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Chandler. The driving message in that for me was the stuff that makes life worth living is the stuff that keeps young people alive. It's not about the money, but about the stuff that makes life worth living. Thank you, though. That was a really profound presentation. But we've got quite a bit of time now, which we're going to preserve for questions. And I'm sure some of the points that you were forced to take out, you might be able to weave into some of your answers. So, yes, please just introduce yourselves when you ask a question.
My name's Rob. I work with a company called Outcare. So we essentially go into the male metropolitan prisons in WA and work with the Aboriginal inmates and prepare them for training, working for employment when they get released. So that's what our role is here. Professor Chandler, I wonder if I can see that slide with the points with the 8 points you had up on there. I just put it down.
These cultural, what I call cultural continuity factors.
Yes.
There you go. And it's important to stress that, I mean, if we just all workshopped it for a while. So let's say I was successful in communicating the kind of broad outlines of what is intended by the notion of cultural continuity and put it to each of you, or collectively to you, what would be a way of indexing that? I'm sure you would come up, as we did, with things. This isn't any pristine list. It's just what dictates the list is that you ought to be able to make the case that it's a marker of owning past or future. And you have to, and this is the technical part, you have to be able to get that information on, in this case, 2 and 3 bands. So there are a lot of things we could have put in that list, which we can't, simply because we get it for a third of the bands or half the bands. So in that sense, it's driven by practicality rather than theory.
And if you ran that list against classical Greece or Renaissance Florence or 19th century London or 21st century Perth, it's the same list.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, and I hope this was the point that I tried to kind of point out at the beginning, that if there's anything that comes close to being what is debated in the literature as a transcultural universal, and certainly it wouldn't be hard to find people who just say that's an empty set, but the closest I think you could come to it are things that somehow mark the very constitutive possibility of individuation. So that's a little complicated, I suppose, but I tried to make the point that it doesn't matter where you're from. You can't be what we've come to understand a person to be if the way you understand yourself and are understood by others is to be something that persists. I mean, imagine you're Joseph and his coat of many colors, and you're off somewhere for 20 years and you come back. People really want to know, are you some pretender? Are you the real Joseph? Where's your strawberry birthmark? Or whatever, right? You've got to have some way of coming to understand that when we talk about persons or individuals, that there's a way in which they are persistent in time in the face of change. And similarly, if you just had a bunch of people all gathered in one spot that didn't have a tether running back to common history and didn't have a common investment in the future, it wouldn't be a culture, it'd just be a crowd of people. And that would be true whether we're talking about indigenous people or people in contemporary or classical Greece or wherever one looks, I think. I mean, I know that the issue of alcoholism is an important problem in Australia. It's certainly an important problem in Canada. A kind of language that I think is helpful in trying to think about that is to talk about upstream and downstream causes and effects. Okay. And so there's no doubt that communities that are saturated in alcohol, that all kinds of bad things happen. And in some sense, you could say the alcohol is causally connected to the bad things that are happening, and you wouldn't be mistaken about that. But I think if one looks upstream, alcoholism is not a cause; it's a consequence of things that are still further upstream. Okay, so the question then, since everything, your cause is my effect in this sort of descending cascade of events, the question is, where does one best commit the resources? And part of that's what I mean to contain in this little aphorism about cultural wounds require cultural medicine, is that I think if you just jump all over the alcoholism problem, there are times that perhaps that's unavoidable, but you're ignoring all the kind of upstream issues that caused alcoholism to be a problem in the first place. And so my sense is that the kind of draconian measures that often happen as you go downstream tend to all backfire. The problem, I think, if you keep looking for further and further upstream issues, like I could make a case, I think, I could convince some arm of the British Columbia or Canadian government that building basketball courts for Aboriginal kids was the smart money way to prevent suicide, or something like that. Right? There would certainly be people who would say, basketball courts, you're kidding me, right? How can we possibly justify spending money on building a cultural facility or training people to somehow rehabilitate a nearly extinct indigenous language? How can we justify spending tax dollars on that as a potential solution to alcoholism, suicide, HIV infection, whatever? So the tensions are kind of always operative. But I guess my pitch would be that if you're going to try to solve, walk into my neighborhood, my patch, and here's a community that is very hard to distinguish just on its face from another community 20 miles away. And the guys over here had no suicides and only the occasional accident, and their kids finished school. And over there, just the opposite. And so what distinguishes them? And my sense is you've got to move far enough upstream in your search for answers to these questions that you're dealing with. You can't get that kind of cultural variability without searching for cultural solutions. That's, I guess, my kind of bottom line. Yeah, no, I mean, perhaps slightly hidden behind your question is when you see all this variability, and that's just like a snapshot in time. Okay? So at this moment, when we take all these measurements, this community has all these attributes that seem to be protective, and this community doesn't. We need to know how they got there, okay? And that's inherent in your question, right? And but part of the things that I suggest don't work are really meant as predictors, things like urban, rural, are ways of trying to get at that. They're primitive ways. That it wouldn't be foolish for someone to kind of walk in naively and be told this is kind of variability, and for them to ask, well, is it because those guys are, so many of those guys are now forced into an urban, or chosen to go into an urban environment? Or is it really being out there in the boonies, the sticks or bush or whatever you call it, that is so heart-numbing, you know? It's a good question. And when the answer is no, then you haven't solved the problem, but you've whittled away a little bit on you to say, well, what it isn't. Right? And sort of that's, I think, the kind of way to inch toward a real answer. My sense is that there is no really evident way in which the beneficent arm of the non-Aboriginal community has somehow can be held responsible for these changes. I mean, we have casinos, things like that. So there are various things that happen that sort of wealth pours into communities. I know in your own mining industry and stuff, communities in which there was probably no job to be had in 100 miles, now they're jobs, and people have money and aren't used to spending it, and maybe spend it in unhealthy ways, and I mean, that certainly happens in Canada. But some of these fortuitous things landing as a result of changes that are happening because of globalization, because of modernity or technology, it's hard to fit those into this picture of these communities got self-government because. The answer isn't because they suddenly got more money. It isn't because the government suddenly became beneficent and decided to let them have it. They had to wrench it out of their hands through community efforts. Now there is it's kind of chicken and egg problem. Where did the gumption to start that fight come from? Huh? Well, I don't know. I'm not a magician. I don't know the answer to that. But that's a good question, and it's a hard question to answer.
So just to add another question to that is, are organisations that do things for less helpful than organisations that enable, facilitate, and allow local leadership to emerge? Can we be that clear about it, or is that a bit hard-edged?
I'd mostly want to buy into the implication of your question, which is that things that are sort of find their inception in grassroots initiatives tend to work in a way that initiatives imported from the outside, no matter how well-intended, often don't. Although I think there's probably a reality that there are some communities that are in such, I speak now of Canada, I don't know enough about Australia, but there are communities in Canada that are so devastated that you would wait till hell froze over before they were able to, some kind of pump priming, which actually is in violation of the idea of self-initiated. It may be required. I'm not a social change expert, but I do know that there are communities that if you said, we won't do anything unless the initiative emerges from the community, you might be waiting a long time in some cases. But it seems the onus is then on you to not just import some made-in-Canberra solution, but to try to take steps that would facilitate the communities taking steps. I mean, that would be a good thing, it seems to me, just in principle. Right?
Yes, I was just going on from that. It's saying like, why do they have to step in? Why do they have to step in? I have the fact that they don't
No, no,
Interesting. I mean, we work out in the community, and it's not, give us time to grieve for our past. Live that time. Maybe we're still not in the right part of our grieving process for what it was. Maybe we're there. You know what I mean? And there's different, from what I can gather, there's different parts to grieving. We might be at the angry part at the moment. But different people are different. Yeah, maybe as a culture, that's where we're at. We need to have the acceptance and a lot of our children, like my mother was a stolen generation. Myself and my sister and we were brought up in the bush so that because we looked white, and so when we saw, for instance, if we saw dust coming, we need to hide, dig a hole to bury ourselves and stuff like that. Our children hear our stories, we hear our mother's stories, so we're still, I suppose in a way, angry about that. You know what I mean? And then all the pressures that are put on us. And, we've just been to we've had 2 young people suicides in time, a couple of months now. These are young men with jobs, loving families, not on drugs, lots of friends, and have suicide. Wow. And when you're in the community, it's just, we feel that it is a part of, feeling that they never ever get. It's always the pressure to do more and more and more and more. And when you do succeed, even the Aboriginal community wants you to go more and more and more because you're the person that's standing out there. So there's more and more and more pressure. So I think at the moment it's about we're still breathing. And that's just my opinion.
just a couple of things to say in response to that. I mean, what you say is very strong and heartfelt. I think there is a kind of disconnect, certainly in Canada, the way that new projects get funded. They're inherently short-term. You get a grant for 3 years, you're laughing. 5 years, that's unheard of. Right? And it takes a long time to get things off the ground. And at least in Canada, the health research enterprise has its interpretive roots of understanding in the sort of the bench sciences of hearts, lungs, brains. These people are accustomed to funding double-blind trials and what have you. And so when you initiate a program in Indigenous communities in Canada, even if you had the time, which you never had the time, you couldn't prove to anyone's satisfaction that it was money well spent. And so there's, these are problems that I think if you're trying to address issues that have these kind of historic cultural roots, there are no quick fixes. And yet we're in a research economy that demands outcomes that are unrealistic and time frames that are impossible. So I don't know what will be required for that to change. It's not going to happen quickly.
I have one more question, and that's, what do you mean by self-government? What does that, what range of things does that catchphrase include?
Well, we were perhaps a little loose in our definition of that. We could have made it tighter, and fewer people might have qualified. But there are communities, Indigenous communities, in which they have elections, elected officials, they tax their members. They have community-driven initiatives that are paid for by money that comes to these bands in one way or another. And then there are other communities in which it's every man for himself. And so having an elected band council was the minimal criteria for saying they had a, quote, measure of self-government. But it's very, you could play that lots of different ways.
So it didn't necessarily mean that services were all run by that self-governing.
Right. One of the things I didn't show is when you list out one at a time, these, what I'm calling cultural continuity factors, and say, well, are they taken one at a time related to very variable outcomes of suicide? Another question you could ask is, how are they correlated one with the other? There's some fairly fancy-dancy research tools that can ask things like, whatever the intercorrelations of these items, do they make a unique contribution to the mix? So there are ways of sort of sorting that out a bit. But unquestionably, the self-government variable is most closely correlated with every other variable, because it is a kind of a linchpin. To the extent that you've got some measure of self-government, then you're in a leveraged position to influence the school system, influence the health delivery system. It would be very hard to actively influence the health delivery system if you didn't have some measure of self-government. So, so it's two things are important about that, I think, just to be clear. One is that, yes, these things have internal correlations. Yes, they each make an independent contribution to the total mix, but some are in more of the kind of jump seat position than others.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I'd just like to invite you all to join me in really thanking Professor Chandler for and recognising his original apologies about talking about this stuff in a heady and theoretical way, but I think we really did get nonetheless, a very heartfelt and very thoughtful discussion that obviously reflects decades of thinking and tireless research work. So thank you very much. And I think we've got a light lunch outside. Small, very light lunch, but enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Are you being picked up now, or are you going to join us for a light lunch? Oh, you exhausting. It's like if you drill a hole, you get right to the other end of the earth, don't you? No, it's actually New York City and Perth. So I don't know your flight. This week I was sending packages, and the chap behind the desk, very post office Grand Central Station, called me up and said, "We saw Perth." He said, "Did you know that you drilled a hole right through the earth? You'd end up actually on Rockville Island." Yeah. So are you going anywhere outside those? Keep them in the head. But then again, it's well-meaning people. But it's just had 200 years of decisions being made in London. Remember? 1901. Most of the decisions that matter were being made in London, you know. And so we've come from that. The Enlightenment gave us many things, but it fucked us up as well.
Sure did. And part of the trouble with this is anytime you get people to control things, they don't ever want to give it up no matter how ludicrous it is.
Yeah. I'm an Aristotelian, I have to say. But maybe now I've got to that point where everything I see, I just see Aristotle writ large. So I've got to be careful. You know, like when you got a hammer. Oh no, sorry. What's the line? Hammer and nail. What's that line about?
I only know if I had a hammer.
Hammer and water. Yeah. When you're a hammer,
Everything is a nail.
everything is a nail. Yeah. And when you're an Aristotelian, everything is a polis.
Is there a way of improving on
I'm looking. Oh yeah, that's it. I have to give you It's on now. Are you coming along? Yeah, I'm coming.
Have something to eat.
Here. Do you want something to eat this morning? Oh, thank you, whichever you've got in there. They're like
what do you got?
We've got some rolls, we've got some fruit,
That's
sandwiches.
funny because we have breakfast with
Yeah.
yeah. The present high school now we're going to use
I can come out and get these.
No, we'll get and a lot of that was well, yeah.
That's why I was just talking to the relationship Australia thing saying to them. I said, the arts, the criminal arts or the arts thing, a lot of it is obvious that strengthening agriculture is really key to what I'm doing. And what I was trying to get my head around is how do you get non-Aboriginal people to understand that?
Well, I would shut down Relationship Australia or make them never do things in a head office where you bring the community, individuals in to get their services. You work out how to engage the idea of nurturing relationships in community, and you have communities develop those services and that way you tell the stories in community. I agree that my answer to that is give me the Commonwealth budget and I will cut funding to anybody who does head office in city centralised widget services. That's the answer.
Do we do any type of this research for Australia?
Yeah, we do. We do, but we know it's actually up to the board and the executive to go, you know what, this isn't the right way to do things, to do everything in head office. And to do everything, bring people, you know, like, I don't know how you would have heard me, but I go on and on and on about place space. We're doing it this week in New Zealand. Because all these
I
answers
know
come.
staff, we do standby schooling. At the moment, standby staff is very
Yeah.
and they won't go into a family if they're not fighting. So the Aboriginal doesn't define them.
No, but they're dealing with the kind of file system of things that are all broken down.
Yeah.
But my point is we're then with their building community.
Early intervention.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we put in strategic planning?
Yeah, it is. But not fast enough for me.
Not fast enough for what we're starting from.
Yeah.
I'll see you later.
Yeah, so do I see you at 1? Oh, okay.
Oh, no, I won't. I'll be in. Yeah.
See ya. Making a bit of noise. What's it up to? That's all right.
I have my eye on you.
Oh, did you? What colour?
How did we do this in the first place? It's just on the back here. Making all sorts of noise here. And everything just moves so fast. They've got all these new angled.
That's enough.
Oh, excellent.
It's always this
I
If we order the
know.
right number, then we have 5 plates of food. So then we order half as many as we know we've got people. And it's usually about right, but you're always so nervous
Yeah.
that you're going to starve people.
Quite. Do you know how to work this thing out? I'm trying to just sort of like
What are you trying to do?
just close it and
Oh,
get it
okay.
back to
You
me.
need the
Oh, there's a
F, escape.
I didn't know there was
And
a
then-
keyboard. I was like, what?
Like that. And now pull it out.
Okay. Oh, that's all cool because yep, it's out. That's great. Look at this.
There's your control panel. That's what we're looking
I
for.
do,
in
I'm so
community
like.
development, is the control panel. The dashboard.
It's there and you just.
So is this, you know, there's this, I'm not, my discipline's economics, not psychology. But is your discipline social psychology or just straight psychology? Or would it be called social